about the Treaty of Paris and these negotiations that take place in order for this to happen. Well, Cornwallis' surrender in October of 1781 at Yorktown is going to mark the end of the fighting, the hostility, so to speak. The Americans don't gain formal independence until they sign a peace treaty with England. France and the United States had not agreed to negotiate separate treaties with the British, but the American commissioners are going to hint to the British that they're going to be willing to accept a separate treaty. And so, because France also declares war on the British, there's going to need to be a treaty between them as well. The American representatives that we send include John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, and Henry Lawrence. Though Jay and Franklin handle most of the actual negotiations, France is going to be more interested in long-term relations with the Americans' former enemy, while Jay is going to be more interested in the immediate issues at hand. So finally, the commissioners finished their work, and a preliminary treaty was approved in November of 1782, and the final treaty is going to be signed the next year in 1783. And that becomes known as the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which ends the American Revolution. If you remember, there is another Treaty of Paris from 1763, and in that treaty we end the French and Indian War. But this treaty of 1783 is going to be also negotiated between England and France with a new key player in there, the American colonists, and they're going to be, it'll end the American Revolution. If you look over here at this picture, Benjamin West left his famous painting of the treaty negotiations unfinished because the British commissioners are not going to sit for the picture. They're embarrassed by this. They're embarrassed that this greatest army, greatest navy in the world have just lost a conflict to these ragtag American colonists. And they refuse to sit for a painting to negotiate this treaty. So what were the terms of the Treaty of Paris? Well, in this map, it's going to show North America after the treaty. So the U.S. is shown in white. So we're going to get all of this land from the British, and it's going to become the America that we know today, the United States of America. By separating the American concerns from the French ones, the commissioners are going to manage to negotiate a more favorable treaty for the Americans. First and foremost, the British are going to agree to accept American independence, which was our main goal of the Revolutionary War. But the treaty is going to go further. The British acknowledge that the boundaries of the new population, or this new nation, is set from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes to Spanish-controlled Florida. So we're going to get not only the 13 colonies from which we're fighting, but also all of the land that the British owns in what is now the United States. However, two other items are going to prove very, very difficult to negotiate. And the British agreed to eventually remove their troops from the frontier, but they're not going to fully withdraw until the War of 1812. And we're going to see that conflict come back up, because when we fight the War of 1812, which some people refer to as the Second War for Independence with Britain, because we're going to fight Britain again in the War of 1812. Just to foreshadow here, we beat them twice. The Americans are also going to agree to return Loyalist property taken during the Revolution, but the U.S. is not going to fulfill their part of this agreement either. But we will have to deal with those British forts in the West over in this area that are still there during the War of 1812. As per terms of the treaty, they were supposed to abandon those forts, but by 1812, they're still there. The British are going to offer Americans good terms for this treaty for two reasons. First, the American commissioners performed very well in these negotiations. For that reason, you're going to see these names again. John Jay is going to be the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Okay, he's good at negotiating. And second, faced with the choice of whether to make concessions to a new, weaker nation that controls the Mississippi River, or have France or Spain control that territory, England is going to let the Americans have it. Okay, so it's either let the Americans have control of this Mississippi River, or have to negotiate with France or Spain, who are both stronger at this point than the British. Stronger than the Americans. Because we're a new nation, we're going to have to figure a lot of stuff out, and that's what we're going to talk about in our next project, the figuring out of that stuff. So, strategically, they give it to the Americans. In the back of their minds, the British always have that they're going to come take this land back. We've let the Americans have it, and we're going to come back and take it back at some point, and this is going to be British-controlled territory. Again, foreshadowing, we beat them twice. So state constitutions are going to reflect their status as these sovereign territories. When we say this sovereign, that means they're able to make decisions for themselves. So while many of these states' constitutions reflect the values and makeup of the original colonial constitutions, there are going to be some significant changes in these documents. And the new constitutions reflect Americans' distrust of a strong central government. For logical reasons here. We just got rid of a strong, what we see as a tyrannical king, a tyrant, someone who sought to steal our liberties and our unalienable rights, so to speak. So these new constitutions are going to reflect that. Like, we don't want a strong central government, but they're going to retain as what we see as the best of this British system of government. So we're going to structure our government into an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch. And that's going to be a common feature of the state constitutions and also what you see in the states today. States had the power to declare war, control the courts, and handle other government functions. State constitutions also grant a large amount of authority to the legislative branch rather than to the executive. So the executive is like the head of the government, the president, so to speak, or if you look at the state level, it'd be the governor. And that legislative branch is going to be the ones that are making the laws. So they're going to put more of the authority in the legislative branch. And the reason that they do this is because this is the largest branch of government, the most people. So you have the authority resting in the largest body of that, or the largest branch of that three-branch government. And we do this, again, largely for fear that this strong executive could seize power and start acting like a king instead of a representative of the people. And we want to reaffirm that by putting the authority in the legislature. So these state constitutions are going to include provisions for bills of rights, which, modeled after the English Bill of Rights of 1689, protect American citizens from abuses by any branch of government. Their colonial counterparts tend to protect citizens from the British Crown, but not from Parliament. So what are some of the social reforms that we see during this revolutionary era? It's not going to just lead to political changes, but also to many society changes. In most states, there becomes a deeper separation of church and state. While some states maintain an established church, most move towards the idea that Jefferson puts forth in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which includes a separation of church and state, along with the individual's ability to worship as they please, free from government interference. And what this means in the light of that time is that you didn't have a state-sponsored church. You didn't have one church that was supported by the colony, and the governor certainly wasn't also going to be the head of the church. So separating those two entities. Citizens in many states, particularly in the North, speak out against slavery. During the Revolution, many of these leaders had spoken of British control over the colonies as slavery, and we considered ourselves slaves of the British Empire. And so after the war, we began to question American slavery as well. Not that they did before, but to a greater degree now. And by the beginning of the 19th century, most northern states had eliminated slavery. And although it was frequently a graduated emancipation, which means that we're going to gradually give them freedom, with a slave gaining freedom once they reach a certain age. In some regards, the revolution is going to signify an end to the old social order as well. And though no formal aristocracy similar to the English one existed in America, the ideas of freedom and equality that become very widespread during the Revolution are going to lead people to no longer consider certain members of a society superior to others. We even write it into the Constitution that we will not grant titles of nobility. We're not going to have barons and lords and ladies and baronesses running around in America, that everyone's going to have an equal social status or have the ability to have an equal social status. And this is going to be reflected not only in the way people interact with others, but also in the breakup of many large estates that have previously belonged to the Loyalists. One major social change that occurred largely because of the Revolution was that of new state governments become more responsive to the needs and concerns of their people. Again, that's what we wanted from the king to begin with, and that's what we are going to write into our governments once we get the chance to do that. I'm going to skip this slide for right now. We're going to come back to that when we talk about the Articles of Confederation. So let's talk about the role of women. Women are also going to enjoy a newfound freedom during and after the Revolutionary War. Many are going to play an active role by taking over what was traditionally male tasks during the Revolution, such as farming, working in businesses, traveling alongside their soldier husbands, and in some cases, such as Deborah Sampson or Molly Pitcher, putting on disguises and joining the Continental Army. Some women also influenced the ideas surrounding the independence movement itself, such as Abigail Adams. She was, an early advocate for equality for women. And she suggested to her husband, John, that if the revolutionary leaders failed to remember the ladies, that is, not allow them to have a voice in the new U.S. government, then they would start a revolution of their own. And John Adams did not take her very seriously, but her ideas are later going to inspire the women's suffrage movement in the 19th century, which will eventually be realized in the 20th century. Women are also going to find more opportunities in the area of education. Until the Revolution, many women couldn't read or write, but by the end of the war, many schools for girls are going to be founded, and the number of women who can read and write are going to increase greatly. Let's also talk about some African Americans in the war. The picture you see here, James Armistead, he's going to be a slave, and he spies for George Washington during the Revolutionary War. African Americans play an important role in the Revolutionary War, and from the earliest days for the struggle of independence, some revolutionary leaders see British tyranny as a form of slavery, which we've already talked about that, and begin to consider that freedom might apply to slaves as well. So, more people are going to become vocal critics of slavery, and some slave owners, such as George Washington, are going to make arrangements to eventually free their slaves. George Washington, in his will free his slaves upon his death. Seeing an opportunity, British commanders offer freedom to any slave who fights against the British colonies. And we don't talk a lot about this. This is called Lord Dunmore's Proclamation. It comes out of Virginia, and they offer freedom. Like, if you will fight for us, we will grant you your freedom. And a lot of the slaves are going to take them up on that offer. And the British will do what they can after the war to relocate those slaves to areas in Canada, to some areas in Africa, in order to ensure that their freedom for fighting in the British Army. British authorities are generally going to treat slaves that come over to their side as captured property instead of free men. So most likely slaves that did gain their freedom are going to do so by escaping from the British during battles. And the British are also going to take some of those men after the Revolutionary War to settlement areas. About 5,000 black troops are going to fight on the side of the Continental Army. And it's going to be typical in later wars that they were assigned non-combat duties, but they're going to take part in some of the war's major battles. Let's talk about the role of Native Americans. In the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson accuses King George III of encouraging Indian savages to attack the colonists. However, while some Native Americans do join the fight during the Revolution, most are going to stay out of the conflict. Members of some New England area tribes not only support their colonial neighbors, the Americans, but they even went as far as joining the Minutemen and fighting alongside these white soldiers. Other Indian tribes are going to be angered by settlers moving in and taking their land, and they're going to attack settlements along the frontier. They're going to be defeated. The Revolution is going to split the Iroquois Confederation into two. And some tribes support the colonists, others take side with the British, and the later group, the one that support the British, are going to be feel that aiding the British will give them a better chance of keeping the white settlers out of their land, which might have proved true if the British had won the war. The territory England gave to America under the 1783 Treaty of Paris is going to include a lot of Native American land, and the British don't consult with the Native American allies before they do this. They just give them this land that they considered theirs. The Indians who support the British during the Revolution are going to lose much of their land eventually. And those who supported the colonists are going to lose theirs as well. So one of the big losers in this conflict are going to be the Native Americans. This also leads to the creation of this idea of an American character. The Revolutionary War leads to the development of what many refer to as the American character. One of the elements of this is new nationalism. When we talk about nationalism, that's being proud of your nation. So as the war progresses, more and more colonists see themselves not as British subjects, but as this new idea, we're Americans. And furthermore, people also begin to see themselves first as Americans and then as citizens of these individual colonies. So the development of a national identity comes partly because the war forced many people to move around and visit different parts of America, something that almost certainly wouldn't have been done otherwise. So soldiers participating in various battles are going to travel throughout the colonies, and they're going to relocate after the war. The same is true for patriot leaders who travel to places such as New York and Philadelphia in order to meet as a Continental Congress. And people begin to see that other people are fighting for the same goals. And they start to feel as if the colonies are a unified nation. And ironically enough, sometimes that's what war does. It unites more than it separates. So the ideals set forth in the Declaration of Independence also help create a national identity, and they form an important part of this new American character. The impact of the American Revolution is going to spread far beyond the 13 colonies. Nationalist movements around the globe are later going to be based on the ideas that come out of the American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence is going to inspire some documents that look a lot like our Declaration of Independence, such as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen during the French Revolution, which the Marquis de Lafayette, with the help of Jefferson, helps author, as well as the Declaration of Sentiments from the Seneca Falls Convention in the 1840s, which was our women's rights movement, and that's going to focus on political equality for men. So the effects of this are going to be seen for many, many years to come. All right, let's look at some discussion questions real quick, and we'll conclude this discussion. What did the Americans gain from the Treaty of Paris? And what did the British see as an advantage in giving the Americans such generous terms? What roles did women, African Americans, and Native Americans play in the war? And how did the Revolution create a new American character? If you'll answer those questions in your notes, we will discuss them in class, and have a great night.